Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest today is Lynn McGuire. She's a Leon Jaworski Professor of Biomedical Ethics, Director at the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine. And we're going to talk about the ethical, and the legal, and the social implications of genomics and human genetics. So, Amy, thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. What are some of the, I know this has been attracting ethical issues for a long time, but what are some of the current ethical issues surrounding genomics and genetic engineering and things like that?
Yeah, so certainly, the idea of doing gene editing has generated a lot of attention in the last couple of years. The ability to go in and actually change your genes offers great promise, but also raises a lot of ethical concerns regarding sort of, how we influence nature. And from that perspective, and the other sort of perennial issue in human genetics and genomics deals mostly with privacy issues. And this gets played out in different ways as new discoveries are made. The last couple of years, we've seen sort of a resurgence in concerns about privacy related to direct-to-consumer genetic testing and genetic genealogy, and the use of information that's available in those databases by those whom we may not have anticipated originally, like law enforcement being able to use that information to help them in their criminal investigations.
Yeah, what happens if, I get my gene sequence like by Ancestry.com? I don't know if they're around anymore. 23andMe, I guess they used to be, but, one of those services, like, does my data forever stored, and who can access it?
So it depends what company you're using. It's really important that if you're doing direct-to-consumer genetic testing, that you're familiar with their terms of service, and particularly their privacy provisions within those terms of service. 23andMe and Ancestry, which are two of the largest companies, they do keep your data, and oftentimes as part of your terms of service, they may ask you if they can use your data for research purposes. I know 23andMe does, and the majority of people who sign up for 23andMe agree either implicitly or explicitly to have their data stored and used for research purposes. And part of the part of the business model for companies like 23andMe is to amass these very, very large databases of individuals' genetic information, and then to sell the access to that data to pharmaceutical companies and others that can use it to develop new drugs and to make new discoveries. So you have to kind of understand where your information is going. With regard to law enforcement access to these databases, again, all of the companies have different policies and practices. 23andMe and Ancestry, the two largest companies, have said that they will not share customer data with law enforcement agents for the purpose of using it for their investigations unless there's a valid warrant that's issued. Some of the other companies, like Family Tree DNA, are allowing law enforcement to access customer data, or not to access the data, but to match to individuals who that there may be a relative match, a genetic relative might be in the database. So to get information about those matches using their data if individuals don't opt out of it, and you have an option to opt out when you sign up for their services or when you're a customer. So
I guess, is it transparent to figure out when you're signing up with a service what's going to happen with your data, or is it buried in a huge terms of service? Like, is it obvious, or is it confusing?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the major problems, is sometimes it can be buried a little bit in the terms of service, and we know that most people don't sort of read through the fine print when they're signing up for a service like that online. So it's really important to kind of be looking for it. Some of the companies will actually ask whether you want your information used in certain ways, and you have to make a proactive decision when you sign up. And others, it's really just sort of an opt-out that's mentioned in their terms of service, and you have to know to look for it and then have to take proactive measures yourself in order to opt out of certain things. So it really depends on the company, and it really requires consumers to be educated and to be aware of what they're looking for.
So what are some of the other ethical issues? I mean, are there any medical treatments right now that require someone's genes to be sequenced, or like very sensitive, non-changeable data to be obtained?
So we're increasingly seeing the use of genome sequencing being integrated not only in biomedical research, but also in clinical care. Yeah. So it's primarily being used right now. This technology is being used for diagnostic purposes. And so you can sort of sequence somebody's genome, and you may find everything from that they have some sort of genetic disorder, but you've never been able to figure out what it is. And the use of genome sequencing allows you to kind of identify what the biological basis of their condition is. Or you can also, get information from individuals around their predisposition to certain diseases. So what's the likelihood that they'll based on their genetic information, what's sort of the predictive likelihood that they might be at higher risk for certain kinds of common or complex disorders. So it is being used in a variety of clinical settings. It's important to know that we were talking about privacy related to direct-to-consumer genetic testing. There's enhanced privacy protections when you're dealing with health information in a medical setting. And so we have, for example, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA, and that protects against unauthorized disclosures of genetic information. And we also have some laws that protect against the discriminatory use of genetic information in certain settings like health insurance and employment.
Well, are the laws strong enough? Are they adapted to genetic information, or do they deal with information that wasn't really contemplated, that could come from genetics?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So some of the laws that we have in place are specific to genetic information. So the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which is commonly known as GINA, is a law that specifically prohibits the discriminatory use of genetic information for health insurance and employment. With regard to, is that strong enough? I think many people would say it's not, because there are many holes and areas where it doesn't protect against discrimination based on genetic information. Things like other areas of insurance, like life insurance, long-term care, disability insurance, as well as other sort of social uses of genetic information that might be stigmatizing or discriminatory. And so a lot of people, I think, would like to see stronger protections in place. And there are others who have argued, just like you're saying, why are we treating genetic information special in these circumstances? Shouldn't we be protecting all sort of sensitive health information in the same ways?
What are there ethical issues that the common person that hasn't sat and thought about it would be surprised to hear? What are some of the, I guess, strange or new or really thorny ethical issues that have come up now that we can sequence genes?
So yeah, it's hard to say what the normal person has sat around and thought about. I mean, I think actually we've done quite a bit of research talking to individuals about their concerns with regard to genetics and genome sequencing. And I actually think a lot of people think about things that are much more fantastic than actually can happen. People have very wild imaginations about the things that we can do with genetic information. The surprises, I think, for example, we've been talking about law enforcement using genetic information to help them in their investigations, or using the power of genetic information to make sort of matches to, connect people who are genetically related to each other, and using that in their investigations. I think that was quite surprising to some people. Thinking back in hindsight, it's not terribly surprising, since we've been using genetics and forensic investigation for quite some time now. But the ways in which they were accessing and using those tools, I think, was unanticipated by many people. Other things that I think people worry about really have to do with things like, can we use genetic information to great social harm? Can we use it for, genetic warfare and things like that. And I think there's some merit to those concerns, although we haven't seen that play out to any extent. And so I think there are surprises. I think, the power of genetics is incredible. But on the other hand, I think we're also starting to get some levity and understanding what genetics can and can't tell us. So I think there was sort of this hype around the Human Genome Project and sequencing the human genome for many years. And people thought, well, this is going to be kind of the holy grail of telling us everything we need to know about our own health now and in the future. And people are coming to the realization, I think the common people are coming to the realization that genetics is important, but it's not all powerful and it doesn't tell us everything. It's not sort of a crystal ball, that it's one piece of the puzzle that contributes to our health and our well-being in the future. But it's only one piece of the puzzle, and equally as powerful is information about our environment and other factors that influence our daily lives.
Are there, so for instance, in order to, rent a car, I need to give my driver's license. Some places they want your social security number. Are there places popping up that in the future will say, well, we have to have your gene sequence on file in order for you to use this service or, get this medical care or do whatever it is?
So I haven't heard about that. I think that's one of the concerns that people had. I don't know if you saw the 1997 movie with Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman called Gattaca, but it was sort of a sci-fi movie where that was exactly the premise, right? Where everybody had to get their genome sequenced at birth, and then it was on file everywhere you went, and it dictated what job you could get, and it dictated what, where you could enter into businesses and what kinds of activities you could do in society. And, I think that a lot of the concern over the years has been, we don't want to become a society like they have in Gattaca. And having a society like that is really premised on the misconception that genetics is deterministic, right? That it gives you information that actually would be useful for things like deciding what kind of job you could do. And it's just not the case that's just not the case.
Well, do you see that, again, having your gene sequenced will be a requirement to do anything or access anything in society, or is that well understood and no one's really even attempting to go there at all?
Well, I can't say that it will never happen. I have not heard of any sort of services that require you to have a genome sequence in order to access them. So it's not required that you, get your genome sequence to get medical care. It's not required that you get your genome sequence to do anything that I can think of right now. I think we value a lot sort of individual autonomy, especially here in the United States. And so I think we to the extent that having your genomic information available to you, either in a clinical setting or a direct-to-consumer setting is offered, it's very much an offer, and it's up to people. And there's a lot of people who don't want to know that information. There's a lot of people who have decided not to, even if they had the opportunity to do so, that would decide not to get that information about themselves.
Well, what about when it comes to reproduction? Are couples getting their genes sequenced, and are they looking for the potentiality of them having a child with, let's say, Down syndrome or other maladies? And is it coming into play there? Like what areas of society do you think gene sequencing will be, paramount or very important now or in the future? Yeah,
so, we have for many years now have had genetic tests that have been done to help people identify whether there are carriers of certain recessive conditions. So if and this has been done in particularly in certain populations. So I'm from Ashkenazi Jewish descent. We know that there are certain genetic conditions that are more prevalent in individuals from that particular ancestry. And so before I decided to start my family, I got carrier screening for some of those conditions to make sure that I and my partner were not both carriers that could pass that gene on. And so we've seen the technology evolve where the number of things that people are getting screened for when they're doing family planning has expanded tremendously. And you can imagine when you could do whole genome sequencing and you could actually look for, thousands and thousands of things across the genome that you could both be carriers for. And so certainly we could see the technology being implemented in that way. It's also can be used in the prenatal setting. So once you actually do get pregnant, you could do prenatal testing on the fetus, and you could look for a variety of things. And again, we've been doing that for years, looking for very specific things like chromosomal abnormalities that lead to things like Down syndrome. But you could do things like whole genome sequencing and look for much more subtle changes that might have more or less definitive impact on future health. So it might increase your risks, for example, of, in adulthood getting, like, let's say you find that a fetus has the BRCA gene mutation that increases your risk of getting breast or ovarian cancer as an adult. I think there's some really, important conversations to be said about, or to be had about, whether we use that information to make decisions about terminating a pregnancy or other things like that. So there's a lot of ways in which genomics can be used for family planning, for prenatal screening. You can use it for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So if you know that you have a genetic condition that's either dominant in your family, or you have two recessive carriers for a genetic condition, and particularly if it's a devastating genetic condition, you could do something called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where you do in vitro fertilization, and prior to implanting an embryo, you test the embryo to see if they carry that gene, and you only implant the embryos that don't carry the gene. And that's one way to avoid sort of devastating genetic conditions in future generations. So yeah, there are many ways in which we can use the technology. And certainly there's a lot of discussion about what is the slippery slope and where do we cross the line from really trying to prevent devastating, fatal diseases that bring with them a lot of suffering and pain, over to making value judgments about what lives are worth living that maybe we shouldn't be making.
Are there any countries that are embracing, sequencing all their people? Any ones that are a concern to ethicists around the world?
So there are some companies that have done more population sequencing than we have. And they're really using it for research purposes at this point. But they haven't sort of, as far as I know, slid into the dystopian view of the Gattaca world that we were talking about earlier. But there are some companies, the UK Biobank, UK has a large number of their population that's undergone genomic sequencing. Some of the smaller countries like Iceland have done such. It's easier to do when you have sort of a universal health system that has everybody's medical information in one place. It's a little bit more challenging and complex to do in a country like ours, where there's so much sort of there's so much heterogeneity in where people have their medical information and what software programs are being used and where they see their doctors and who's paying for it and all those kinds of things. The closest thing we have in the United States, I'd say, would be some very large-scale government-initiated programs that are trying to sequence large numbers of individuals, but not, and it's on a voluntary basis, of course, but they're not doing the entire population. So through the National Institutes of Health, we have the All of Us research program, which is attempting to recruit 1 million individuals across the country who would volunteer to share their medical information and have their genome sequenced, and that would be used for research purposes. We also have in the Veteran Affairs division the Million Veterans Project, which is, I think, even further along in collecting genetic information and doing genome sequencing on veterans in the VA system.
So any trends right now in ethics? Do they just kind of lag the technology or ride along with the technology? Or, what do you see the next few years shaping up to be in terms of the ethics of all this?
Yeah, so, one of our goals in ethics as a bioethicist is really not to lag the technology too much. That is often the reality because, things come out, there are new discoveries, and then there's sort of a period of time of which it takes for people to think about what are the ethical implications, what are the policy implications. But one of the ways in which we do our work is really to work alongside the clinicians and scientists who are at the cutting edge. And they're anticipating sort of what's coming down the pike in the next several years. And by being able to collaborate and have conversations, oftentimes we can anticipate some of those challenges and we can try to sort of get ahead of it. I think, right, it's hard to think about the next couple of years, at least, outside of the context of what's currently going on in society around this global pandemic that we're experiencing. So my answer to what are going to be the hot issues in the next couple of years might have been different a couple months ago. I think there's going to be a lot of sort of fallout on the research and clinical side in terms of thinking about how we balance competing values and new discoveries when we're in sort of a global health emergency, and one that's probably going to last quite some time. So I think a lot of the efforts are going to be focused, and particularly in genetics and genomics, I think there's a lot of work to be done to contribute to how we think about infectious disease in that space as well.
Well, very good. What's the best way for people to find out if other people have the same concerns they do about a particular issue, ethics-wise? Is there an organization that they could, look to that's put out papers, or where is there a forum for people to think about this?
Yeah, so there's the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. That's our professional organization of people who are in the field of bioethics, and we have an annual conference every year that, where people present their work and talk about these things. I mean, one of the great things about bioethics is that the people in the field of bioethics are, academics, and they're doing scholarly work, and they're publishing in medical and scientific and bioethics journals, but they're also probably more than in other fields engaged with the media, the mainstream media, and trying to discuss some of the ethical issues that really make it to mainstream media, because these are things that impact all of us in society. And so it's really important to have open dialogue and public dialogue about what values are at stake and what values might be in conflict with each other as we talk through these complicated issues.
Well, very good. Well, Amy, thank you for coming. And what's a reference for listeners? Where can they go and find out more?
Absolutely. Yeah, they can check out our website, which is the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine. We have all kinds of information there on what we do down here in Texas. Okay,
very good. Well, I'm glad we don't live in the Gattaca world, as you said.
That's right. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.